My name is Rafael Meshulam. I'm a professor at the Hebrew University. I've been there for many years. I'm doing research on the chemistry and biology of natural products, mostly, but also some drugs. Like every drug, one has to know as many details as possible. There is no drug that doesn't have side effects. It just doesn't exist. The same is probably true for cannabis. Now, being a chemist, I was particularly interested in the individual constituents of the plant. Surprisingly, the constituents of the cannabis plant were not well known when we started work many years ago, several decades ago. The psychoactive component of cannabis was not known at that time, surprisingly again, because morphine had been isolated from opium almost 150 years before that, and cocaine about 100 years before that, and yet the active component of cannabis had never been isolated in pure form. So my colleague Oni and I went ahead doing that, and we published the compound, reported isolation of the active compound of cannabis, 1964, proved it, elucidated its structure, and a little bit later also synthesized it, so it became available for research. Now, scientists like to work with a specified compound, not just with a mixture, because otherwise it is very difficult to reproduce their results. And indeed, after 1964, there was a lot of work on THC and some of the other constituents, which we also isolated and elucidated their structures. And for the next 20 years, there was a lot of work on these compounds, and much of the things that we know about these compounds, the activity of these compounds, was done at that time. One thing was not known for 20 years, almost 20 years, and that was the mechanism of THC action, surprisingly so. People thought that maybe it has some kind of an unspecified activity, acts on a membrane or something. Well, it turned out to be a mistake, actually. Alan Howlett, young professor at that time of pharmacology at St. Louis, found that there is a receptor, which was later called CB1, and then a person in England identified a second receptor known as CB2, mostly in the periphery, but then at some point it also pops up in the brain, especially neurological diseases. So now we are sure of two receptors that are present, and THC acts on them and stimulates them and causes the activity when needed. Now, receptors are not present in the body because there is a plant outside there. They are present in the body in order to be activated by something that our body produces when and where needed. So we went ahead looking for the compounds in the brain and the periphery that would activate these receptors, and in 1992 and 1995 we reported the most important ones. One of them we called anandamide. Ananda comes from the Sanskrit name of supreme joy, and we were happy after working so hard for identifying a compound which has turned out to have a different chemical structure from the compound in the plant. Rather strange, I would say, because the two compounds do exactly the same, and there was and these compounds which we identified in the brain and in the periphery, they're derivatives of fatty acid. And these compounds are very important because the receptors are found in large amounts, high concentrations in the brain and the periphery. These compounds are extremely important. They act in a huge number of physiological conditions. They interact with other neurotransmitters. They interact with in other systems as well. So they are important players in our body. So there has been a huge amount of work on these two compounds, anandamide, another one we isolated, the 2-AG. And so today we know quite a lot about the mechanism and how they, what they do, and therefore we can also learn a lot about the ability of plant cannabinoids like THC or synthetic cannabinoids that can act on this system, activate it or block it or change the metabolism of compounds that act on it. So it is quite promising, and chances are that we shall have drugs. We already have minor drugs, but I think that we shall have major drugs in the future that act through this particular system. Well, endocannabinoids, this is the short name for endogenous cannabinoids. Cannabinoid is a compound which acts on two receptors. One receptor is found mainly in the brain, the other receptor is found mainly in the periphery. But surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, during certain diseases, the second receptor, which is not present in the brain, starts to pop up. All of a sudden it's available there. So the suggestion was by us, by many others, that actually this receptor, which is not found in the brain, the CB2 receptor is a protective, is part of a protective mechanism. And we have protective systems in our body. The immune system is a protective system. It guards us against microbes and viruses, things like that. And if we didn't have an immune system, we'll be dead within a week, probably eaten up by microbes. Well, but we have the immune system and it guards us. But not everything, not all attacks on us are by things like microbes or viruses, like proteins. There are other things, breaking a bone or having a head smashed or something like that. These are major things. Well, actually, the body has developed protective systems of this type, and indeed the endocannabinoids are part of this protective system, acting through the CB2 receptor, probably also through the CB1 receptor, but through the CB2 receptor, most definitely. And we have seen, for example, in brain trauma, that both the CB1 and the CB2 receptors start working overtime, trying to reduce the damage that has been caused by a head injury. We have seen, and have submitted a paper now, that osteoporosis is reduced. The damage of osteoporosis, the actual osteoporosis itself, is reduced by the endogenous cannabinoids. The endocannabinoid system seems to work. It's not the only one, but it seems to work there. And not very surprisingly, we have found that additional compounds, which actually don't bind to the cannabinoid receptors, but are very close chemically to these endogenous cannabinoids, these compounds, which we call endocannabinoid-like compounds, a strange word, but anyway, these compounds act on osteoporosis. We have mice that under certain conditions can develop osteoporosis, and we see that their bones show osteoporotic features. We see that if we give these compounds, whether it is an endocannabinoid like 2-AG, or whether it's those endocannabinoid-like compounds which we found, they improve the situation, they improve the osteoporosis. Now this is not so surprising. If one goes back and looks at what's going on in the Mediterranean countries, for example, there is less osteoporosis than in Northern Europe. And according to some Greek statistics, if you like to read Greek statistics before you go to bed and sleep, according to Greek statistics, this is due to olive oil. And all the people in the Mediterranean use olive oil. Now, olive oil contains oleic acid, and the compound which acts on osteoporosis is a derivative of oleic acid. It is an endocannabinoid-like compound. So this is what's happening with bones. We have a lot of other indications that the action of the CB2 receptor is mainly a protective action. So we have protective action in brain injury, we have protective action in bones, we have protective action in a lot of inflammatory conditions, and we have looked at rheumatoid arthritis, for example. It is a very powerful, these compounds are very powerful in certain inflammatory conditions. Now, an inflammatory condition, in rheumatoid arthritis, for example, it's an autoimmune disease. The immune system attacks the body itself. I mean, the immune system is normally supposed to be there to attack proteins that come from the outside, but sometimes it doesn't know what it's doing and attacks our own proteins, our own body. Now, we found that the endocannabinoid system protects us. There are many aspects that one can talk about. One is the basic biochemical, pharmacological, scientific aspect of the whole problem. Here we have a new neurotransmitter, a group of compounds that do a huge amount of, have a huge amount of tasks. If we look at related, chemically related compounds, I made a list of that, these compounds are involved in almost all physiological reactions. There are so many of them that I think that here there is so much work to be done by the scientists over the next 20, 30, 40 years. A lot of those compounds are around. Some of them bind to the cannabinoid receptors. Others are just chemically related and bind to other receptors, are involved in many, many other things. And as I mentioned before, those that bind to the CB2 receptors are part of a general protective facility, if you wish, in our body, like the immune system. So that's the basic thing. Then there is the medical thing. We have to find out how we can use them and what are the diseases we can use these compounds against. And there is a huge number of diseases that can be used again in certain types of cancer, a lot of inflammatory diseases, head traumas, things that I just spoke about, diabetes and so on. So there are many things that can be improved. The bone, for example, we just found, I had the results last week, that a bone that is broken, in animals in this case, a bone that is broken takes about 30% less time to heal if the animal is given a mixture of CBD and THC, which are essentially the major compounds in marijuana. 30%, that's a lot of, something that a lot of people can use. There is a difference between mammals, us, and plants. We all produce, meaning humans, pigs, cows, we produce more or less the same compounds. We have an immune system that guards us against all kinds of attacks. With plants, it's different. They don't have an immune system. So they produce a huge amount of plant chemicals for various reasons. So that's why plants have a huge number of compounds and we don't. We have the same compounds as a pig and a swine and so on. As a matter of fact, we are very close biochemically to the pig. Well, pigs may be offended by that.